I captured 5 seconds of footage showing a family of dogmen walking down a trail in the Appalachian mountains. The adults stood at least 7 feet tall with a wolf-like head and walked fully upright on 2 legs. 2 smaller ones flanked it on either side, and one of the juveniles was also moving on its hind legs just like the adult. That footage is the only proof I have of what I encountered deep in those mountains, and what happened after my camera died almost killed me. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I had been hunting alone in a remote section of the Appalachians for 4 days when I found the first tracks. This was late October, cold enough that frost covered the ground each morning, but not cold enough for snow. Most other hunters had already cleared out for the season, which suited me fine. I preferred the solitude and the challenge of working the high country without running into weekend warriors every few miles. The area I was in showed up as blank space on most maps, just green with elevation lines and no trail markers. The tracks were in soft mud along a creek bed where I had stopped to filter water. They measured about 14 inches long with 5 distinct toes and claw marks extending well past the toe impressions. The stride between prints was close to 6 feet, and the depth told me whatever made them was heavy and walking upright. I had seen plenty of bear tracks in my years hunting these mountains, and these were not bear tracks. The foot structure was wrong, more elongated and canine, but no wolf or coyote walks on its hind legs with a 6-foot stride. I took several photographs with my digital camera, including shots with my hunting knife placed beside the tracks for scale. My hands were shaking as I worked the camera, and I had to stop twice to steady my breathing. The rational part of my brain was trying to find explanations that made sense, but the tracks were right there in front of me, clear as day. I have investigated strange occurrences in the backcountry for years, both as part of my job and out of personal interest, and I had never seen anything quite like this. The old-timers in the mountain communities had stories about creatures like this. They called them different names depending on which hollow you were in, but the descriptions were always similar. Tall figures that walked like men but had the heads of wolves or dogs. They moved through the forest without sound and hunted in family groups. Most people dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of tales you tell around a campfire to scare children. I had always been skeptical myself, filing them away with Bigfoot sightings and UFO reports. But standing there looking at those tracks, I remembered something an old hunter had told me years back at a general store in a town whose name I will not mention. He said his grandfather had encountered a pack of them in the 1940s while running moonshine through the backwoods. He described them exactly as the tracks suggested, walking upright with wolf heads and moving in groups. His grandfather had fired at them and sworn he hit one, but it just kept coming. He barely made it back to his truck alive and never went into those particular mountains again. The tracks led away from the creek and up a steep embankment into dense forest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to head back to my camp, pack up, and get out of these mountains. But something else was pushing me forward, a need to understand what had made these tracks. I have always been the type to investigate rather than run, which is probably why I ended up in law enforcement work in the first place. I checked my rifle to make sure it was loaded and began following the trail. The forest was too quiet. In 4 days of hiking, I had grown used to the constant background noise of birds calling, squirrels rustling through leaves, and the occasional deer moving through the underbrush. Now there was nothing. The silence felt unnatural, oppressive. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. I paused every few minutes to listen and look around, but the woods remained still. Whatever had made those tracks had cleared every other animal out of the area. After about a mile of tracking, I found claw marks on a large oak tree. 4 parallel gouges ran vertically down the trunk, starting about 7 feet off the ground and extending down nearly 3 feet. The marks were deep enough that I could fit my finger into them up to the second knuckle. The wood inside the gouges was still fresh and light-colored, meaning these marks were recent, probably made within the last day or 2. I photographed them from multiple angles, again using my knife for scale reference. The pattern of the claw marks was deliberate, not random. They started at the top and dragged downward with consistent spacing between each gouge. This was not an animal sharpening its claws or stripping bark to get at insects. This was marking territory, a clear signal to other creatures that this area was claimed. I had seen similar territorial markings from bears and mountain lions over the years, but never at this height or with this level of force. Whatever made these marks was tall enough to reach 7 feet easily and strong enough to dig deep into solid oak. I continued following the tracks deeper into the forest. The terrain grew rougher with more exposed rock and steeper inclines. The creature I was tracking seemed to have no trouble with the difficult ground, maintaining that same 6-foot stride even when moving uphill over loose stones. I was breathing hard and had to stop several times to rest, but the tracks just kept going at the same steady pace. Whatever this thing was, it had endurance that exceeded human capability. The folklore about these creatures extends back centuries in this region. Native American tribes who originally inhabited these mountains had stories about wolf-headed beings that walked like men and guarded certain sacred areas. The Cherokee called them something that translated roughly as moon eyes, because they were said to be most active during full moon periods. European settlers who moved into the area in the 1700s and 1800s brought their own werewolf legends with them, and these stories merged with the indigenous tales to create the modern dogman mythology. Most researchers who study cryptids classify dogman sightings separately from Bigfoot or Sasquatch encounters. The physical descriptions are distinctly different, with dogmen having canine features, pointed ears, and often moving on 2 legs with a more aggressive, predatory behavior. Bigfoot sightings typically describe more ape-like features with a bulkier build. Dogman reports are concentrated in certain areas, with Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Appalachian region being hotspots. The creatures are usually described as being between 6 and 8 feet tall, with gray or black fur, muscular builds, and wolf or dog-like heads. What interested me about the folklore was the consistent mention of family groups. Unlike werewolf legends from Europe, where the creatures were usually solitary cursed individuals, the American dogman stories often described them traveling and hunting in packs. This made evolutionary sense if these were actual flesh and blood creatures rather than supernatural entities. Pack behavior meant social structure, communication, and coordinated hunting strategies. It also meant that if I was tracking one, there were likely others nearby. Around midday, I found what I initially thought was a large burrow or cave entrance. It was set into the side of a rocky hillside, partially concealed by fallen logs and thick brush. The opening was roughly 5 feet high and maybe 3 feet wide, larger than any fox den or bear cave I had seen in this region. The ground around the entrance was heavily disturbed, with multiple sets of tracks overlapping each other. I counted at least 3 different sizes, suggesting a group of different-sized individuals using this location regularly. I approached carefully, moving slowly and keeping my rifle ready. The smell hit me when I was still about 10 feet away. A musky animal odor mixed with something else I could not quite identify. It was not the scent of death or decay, but rather the concentrated smell of animals living in close quarters, like walking past a large dog kennel. I stopped at the entrance and used my flashlight to peer inside. The tunnel extended back into darkness beyond what my light could reach. The smart move would have been to leave right then. I had found what I was looking for, evidence of something unusual living in these mountains. I had photographs of tracks and claw marks that could be analyzed by experts. Going into that den would be foolish at best and suicidal at worst. But standing there at the entrance, I saw something that made my decision for me. Just inside the tunnel, maybe 6 feet back, was what looked like a deer skull, picked clean and showing marks where it had been deliberately broken open to access the marrow. I pulled out my camera and filmed the entrance to the den, panning slowly to show the disturbed ground and the opening itself. I filmed the overlapping tracks in the dirt and the deer skull visible just inside. The camera battery indicator was showing low, probably only enough power for a few more minutes of recording. I should have saved that battery life, but I did not know what was about to happen. I moved back from the den entrance and began working my way around the hillside to see if there were other entrances or exits. That was when I heard the first sound. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe a quarter-mile away. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, then rose into something between a howl and a roar. The sound echoed off the hills and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Every hair on my body stood up, and my hands gripped the rifle so hard my knuckles went white. I had heard wolves howl before, had heard mountain lions scream, had heard every animal sound these mountains could produce. This was none of those things. The howl was answered by another sound, closer this time, maybe only 100 yards away, then another from a different direction. They were communicating, coordinating. The sounds formed a triangle around my position with the den at the center. I realized with sick clarity that I had walked right into the middle of their territory, and they knew I was here. The silence I had noticed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. Every other animal in the area had cleared out because the apex predators were moving through. I started moving away from the den as quickly as I could while still being quiet. The terrain worked against me, forcing me to navigate around thick brush and over rocks that could turn an ankle or make noise if I was not careful. I kept the rifle up and ready, scanning the forest in all directions. The howling had stopped, which was somehow worse than hearing it. At least when they were making noise, I knew roughly where they were. Now they could be anywhere. I made it maybe 50 yards before I saw movement ahead. Something large and dark slipped between two trees, moving perpendicular to my path. I froze and brought the rifle to my shoulder, tracking the movement through my scope. For just a moment, I got a clear look. It was tall, at least 6.5 feet, moving on two legs with a hunched posture that put its head forward. The shape of the head was distinctly canine with pointed ears. Gray fur covered its body, darker along the back and lighter on the chest. Then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows between the trees as silently as it had appeared. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lowered the rifle slightly and tried to control my breathing. One creature I might be able to handle, but the howls had suggested at least 3, maybe more. Running would be suicide. They could certainly move faster than me through this terrain. Climbing a tree would just trap me. My best option was to move carefully back toward the creek where the ground was more open and I would have better sight lines. I changed direction, angling away from where I had seen the creature and trying to work my way back toward the creek drainage. The forest felt like it was closing in around me. Every shadow could hide one of them. Every sound could be the warning that they were closing in. I tried to remember everything I knew about predator behavior from my years hunting and working in remote areas. Predators typically avoided direct confrontation unless protecting their young or if prey showed weakness. If I could make it clear that I was not worth the effort or risk, they might let me leave. That theory lasted about 5 more minutes before I heard movement directly ahead of me. I stopped and raised the rifle again, peering through the scope. What I saw made my blood run cold. 3 figures were on the trail ahead, moving in a coordinated line. The center figure was massive, easily over 7 feet tall with broad shoulders and a muscular build. On either side were smaller figures, perhaps 5 feet tall, moving with the same bipedal gait. The one on the left was walking fully upright on 2 legs, just like the adult. The one on the right appeared to be transitioning between 2 legs and 4, occasionally dropping to all 4s for a few steps before rising again. I fumbled for my camera with one hand while keeping the rifle pointed in their direction with the other. The camera came on and I hit record, barely managing to frame the shot before they started moving. For 5 seconds I captured them walking down that trail through the forest. The adult in the center, the 2 juveniles flanking it, all 3 moving with purpose and coordination. The gray fur, the wolf-like heads, the muscular builds, everything was exactly as the folklore had described. Then my camera battery died, the screen going black just as the adult turned its head in my direction. I do not know if it saw me. The distance was maybe 40 yards and I was partially concealed behind a large tree. But something made it stop, and when it stopped, the 2 young ones immediately froze as well. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. We all stood perfectly still. I could see the adult's head moving slightly, nostrils flaring as it tested the air. The juveniles stayed close to it, their postures alert and ready to move. Then the adult dropped to all fours in one fluid motion, and the two young ones did the same. They moved off the trail and into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush in seconds. I did not move for a full minute after they vanished, barely breathing, listening for any sign that they were circling back. The forest remained silent except for the pounding of my own heart. I knew I needed to move, to get out of this area while I still could. But my legs felt weak and my hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the rifle. The adrenaline that had been keeping me sharp was starting to drain away, leaving me lightheaded and unsteady. I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths and focus on what needed to happen next. I had to get back to my camp, get my gear, and get out of these mountains. The footage on my camera, assuming it had actually saved before the battery died, was enough. I did not need to push my luck any further. The return trip to the creek felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. I moved as quickly as I dared, keeping to the most open ground I could find, and constantly checking over my shoulder. Several times I thought I heard movement pacing me through the forest, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. Whether they were actually following or my nerves were just shot, I could not say. When I finally reached the creek, I felt a small measure of relief. The water noise would cover any sound I made, and the open ground along the creek bed gave me better visibility. I started working my way downstream toward where I had left the main trail. The sun was getting lower, maybe 2 hours until dark. I needed to reach my camp before nightfall. There was no way I was spending another night in these mountains knowing what was out here. I had made it maybe half a mile along the creek when I found the second deer carcass. This one was more recent than the skull in the den, killed within the last day or two based on the condition of the remains. What was left of it was draped across a fallen log in the middle of the creek. The way it was positioned seemed deliberate, placed there rather than just left where it fell. The kill was efficient, the throat area showing evidence of a powerful bite. But the rest of the carcass was relatively intact. They had fed on it, but not consumed it entirely. I photographed the carcass from the bank, not willing to wade into the creek to get closer. Something about the way it was displayed felt like a message, though I could not say what that message was. A warning, maybe. A demonstration of their hunting ability. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, just food storage for later. Many predators cached kills to return to when they were hungry again. Bears did it, big cats did it. It made sense that these creatures would do the same. The folklore often mentioned the creatures hunting larger game like deer and elk, occasionally taking livestock from farms at the edges of the wilderness. There were stories from the 1800s about entire sheep flocks being destroyed in single nights, with the remains showing the work of something much larger and stronger than wolves. Cattle that disappeared from pastures and were found days later with their throats torn out. Most of these incidents were attributed to wolves or mountain lions at the time, but some of the descriptions did not quite match those animals. What struck me as I stood there looking at that deer carcass was the efficiency of it. There was no wasted energy, no frenzy of violence like you sometimes see with predator kills. This was a clean, professional kill from something that knew exactly what it was doing. That level of hunting skill suggested intelligence and experience. Combined with the pack behavior and coordinated communication I had witnessed, it painted a picture of a highly evolved predator, perfectly adapted to this environment. I continued along the creek as the sun dropped lower. The temperature was falling rapidly, and I could see my breath in the air. My camp was still a couple miles away, and I was pushing the limits of making it before full dark. I picked up my pace, moving faster along the creek bank, even though I knew it meant making more noise. At this point, speed was more important than stealth. If they wanted to stop me, they already knew where I was. The attack came from the right side, from the forest rather than from ahead or behind. I heard the rush of movement a split second before something large burst from the underbrush. I spun and brought the rifle up, getting just a glimpse of gray fur and bared teeth before I fired. The shot was more reflex than aim, and the recoil knocked my shoulder back. The creature veered off at the last second, and I do not know if I hit it or if it had just decided I was too much trouble. I jacked another round into the chamber and back toward the creek, keeping the rifle up and scanning the tree line. My ears were ringing from the shot, making it hard to hear anything else. Nothing came at me again, but I could see movement in the shadows between the trees. At least 2 shapes, maybe 3, moving parallel to my position but not approaching. They were pacing me, staying just at the edge of visibility. Testing me maybe, or just making sure I kept moving in the direction they wanted. I didn't wait around to figure out their intentions. I turned and moved as fast as I could along the creek, not quite running but close to it. The rifle stayed up and ready, and I looked back every few steps to make sure nothing was closing the distance. The shapes in the forest kept pace with me but did not come closer. This continued for at least a mile, maybe more. They were herding me, I realized, pushing me in a specific direction, making sure I left their territory. The sun was touching the horizon when I finally saw the trail marker that led back to my camp. I left the creek and hit the trail at a run, abandoning all pretense of caution. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like rubber, but I didn't slow down until I could see my tent through the trees. I crashed into the campsite, grabbed my rifle against a tree and bent over with my hands on my knees trying to catch my breath. The forest behind me was silent, no movement, no sounds, nothing. They had stopped following once I reached the trail, either because I was far enough from their den or because the trail represented a boundary they chose not to cross. I did not care which. I was alive and I had made it back to camp. I had the footage, assuming the camera had saved it before dying. That was enough. I broke camp in near darkness, stuffing gear into my pack without any organization or care. Everything went in. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, all of it. I would sort it out later when I was back at my truck. Right now I just needed to get off this mountain. I used my headlamp to navigate the trail, moving faster than was safe in the dark but not caring about the risk. Turning an ankle or taking a fall seemed like minor concerns compared to what could be following behind me. The hike out took 3 hours in the dark. 3 hours of constant vigilance and jumping at every sound. But nothing came at me. No howls, no movement in the trees, nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. By the time I reached my truck, my nerves were completely fried. My hands shook so badly I had trouble getting the key in the ignition. When the engine finally started and the headlights came on, I nearly cried with relief. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was back in civilization with lights and people and the comfortable noise of human activity. I checked into a motel and collapsed on the bed with my clothes still on. I slept for 14 hours straight, and when I finally woke up, I spent another hour just sitting there trying to process what had happened. The camera was the first thing I checked once I had coffee and food in me. I plugged it into my laptop with hands that still were not entirely steady and started going through the files. The photographs were all there, the tracks, the claw marks on the tree, the den entrance, the deer skull. Everything was clear and in focus, perfect documentation of what I had found. Then I got to the video file. 5 seconds. That was all the camera had captured before the battery died. 5 seconds of footage showing the adult dogman walking down that trail with the 2 juveniles flanking it. The quality was grainy and the camera had been shaking from my unsteady hands, but the figures were clear enough to see. The wolf-like heads, the bipedal movement, the gray fur, the muscular builds. One of the young ones moving on 2 legs just like the adult. It was all there, undeniable and real. I have watched that 5-second clip hundreds of times now, analyzing every frame, looking for any detail I might have missed. The way the adult moves with such confidence and power, the way the juveniles mirror its behavior, the coordination and awareness they display. This is not some random animal. This is a highly intelligent predator with social structure and learned behavior. The juveniles are being taught by the adult, learning how to move through their territory and how to hunt. The folklore takes on new meaning now that I have seen them with my own eyes. The stories about family groups, about coordinated hunting, about their intelligence and strength. All of it makes sense when you understand what you are dealing with. These are not supernatural monsters or cursed humans. These are flesh and blood creatures that have adapted to live in the most remote regions of North America, staying just beyond the reach of human encroachment. The Native American stories about them being guardians of sacred places might have basis, in fact. If these creatures have been living in these mountains for centuries or longer, they would naturally defend their territory from intruders. What the tribes interpreted as spiritual protection might simply have been very effective territorial behavior. The European werewolf legends that got mixed in probably came from isolated encounters with these same creatures, filtered through the cultural lens of people who had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Modern sightings follow patterns that make sense when you think about habitat and behavior. They are reported most frequently in areas with large tracts of wilderness, low human population density, and abundant game animals. The Great Lakes region, the Pacific Northwest, and the Appalachian Mountains all fit that profile. They seem to avoid areas of high human activity, which is why clear photographs and videos are so rare despite thousands of reported sightings over the years. What I captured was pure chance. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I happened to have my camera ready when they crossed that trail. But it nearly cost me my life. The adult knew I was there from the moment I started following those tracks. It could have killed me at any point, especially when I was at their den. The fact that it did not tells me something important about these creatures. They do not kill without reason. I was not prey. I was not a threat to their young, so I was not worth the risk of attacking. The way they herded me out of their territory showed sophisticated thinking and restraint. They could have attacked and overwhelmed me easily with numbers and strength. Instead, they chose to escort me to the boundary and make sure I left. That decision shows a level of intelligence that puts them closer to great apes or dolphins than to wolves or big cats. They understood that letting me go was better than killing me, and potentially bringing more humans into the area to investigate. I have not returned to those mountains. Part of me wants to go back, to learn more about them and document their behavior. But the smarter part of me knows that I got lucky once and might not be so fortunate a second time. The adult let me go because I was not worth the trouble. If I came back deliberately seeking them out, that calculus might change. I might go from being a minor annoyance to being a genuine threat that needed to be eliminated. I have shared the footage with a few researchers I trust, people who study cryptids and unexplained phenomena with scientific rigor rather than sensationalism. The reactions have been mixed. Some believe it is genuine documentation of an unknown species. Others think it is too good to be true and suspect some kind of hoax. I understand the skepticism. I would be skeptical too if someone showed me this footage and told me this story. But I know what I saw and what I experienced, and no amount of skepticism from others can change that. The scientific establishment will not accept this footage as proof of anything. 5 seconds of grainy video with no supporting evidence beyond photographs of tracks and claw marks is not enough to establish the existence of a new large predator species. To do that, you would need DNA evidence, skeletal remains, multiple clear photographs from different sources, habitat studies, prey analysis, the whole package. One hunter with a short video clip is not going to change the field of zoology. But maybe that is okay. Maybe these creatures are better off remaining in the realm of folklore and unconfirmed sightings. The moment they become officially recognized as a real species, their habitat becomes a target for development, for research, for tourism. The remote areas where they have managed to survive would be overrun with people trying to get their own photographs or trophy hunters wanting to bag something exotic. The creatures themselves would be captured for study or killed for specimens. The Cherokee had it right when they considered certain areas sacred and off-limits. Whether they actually understood that dogmen lived in those places or just recognized that something dangerous made those areas unwise to enter, the result was the same. They left those places alone, and the creatures that lived there were allowed to exist without interference. Maybe that is the lesson here. Some things are better left as mysteries, some places better left unexplored. I still go hunting in the mountains, though I avoid that particular area now. I stick to more trafficked regions where other hunters go, places where the biggest danger is running into a bear or taking a bad fall. When I tell this story around campfires or in hunting lodges, most people smile and nod along like it is just another tall tale. That is fine with me. The ones who have had their own encounters, they listen differently. They hear the details that match their experiences, and afterward they find me privately to share their stories. There are more of us out there than you might think. Hunters, hikers, Forest Service workers, people who spend time in the deep wilderness and see things that do not fit the normal pattern. Most of us do not talk about it publicly because we know how it sounds. But in private, in small groups of people who understand, the stories come out. And the more stories you hear, the more patterns emerge. These creatures are out there, living in the spaces we have not yet filled with roads and houses and strip malls. The footage will probably end up online eventually. One more grainy, cryptid video in a sea of hoaxes and misidentified wildlife. People will debate its authenticity and pick apart every frame looking for evidence of CGI or costume work. That is the nature of this subject. Nothing is ever quite good enough to prove anything conclusively. There is always room for doubt, always another explanation that seems more reasonable than accepting that something unknown is sharing these forests with us. But I know what I filmed. I know what chased me out of those mountains. I know the fear I felt standing at that den entrance and hearing those howls echo through the forest. I know the intelligence I saw in the way that adult moved and the way it chose to let me live. 5 seconds of footage is not much, but it is more than most people ever get. It is proof enough for me. If you are planning to go into the deep wilderness, especially in areas where these creatures have been reported, take the warning seriously. Pay attention to the signs. If you find tracks that do not match any known animal, turn back. If the forest goes silent in an unnatural way, leave immediately. If you hear howls that sound wrong, do not investigate. These creatures have survived for so long precisely because they avoid contact with humans. When they do make contact, it is on their terms and for their reasons. The mountains keep their secrets well. What lives in the deepest parts of the wilderness, in the places too remote for casual hikers and too rough for most hunters, remains largely unknown. We have mapped every square mile of the surface from satellites, but we have not explored every square mile on the ground. There are still blank spaces where anything could be living, spaces where creatures like dogmen can raise their young and hunt and exist without ever being fully documented by science. I consider myself lucky to have seen what I saw and lived to tell about it. The footage I captured might be the best documentation anyone has managed to get of these creatures in their natural habitat. 5 seconds showing a family group moving through their territory. The adult teaching the young ones how to walk upright and move through the forest. It is a glimpse into a world that exists parallel to ours, sharing the same mountains and forests, but remaining separate and hidden. Whether you believe this story or not is up to you. I have the footage, I have the photographs, and I have the memory of those hours spent in their territory, knowing I might not make it out. That is enough for me. I do not need validation from skeptics or recognition from scientists. I know what is out there in those mountains, and that knowledge has changed how I see the wilderness. It is not our domain to do with as we please. We share it with things older and more powerful than us, things that have earned their place through adaptation and survival. The title of this story says I found incredible findings, and I did. But the most incredible finding was not the footage or the tracks or the claw marks. It was the understanding that we are not alone in these forests, and that what shares the wilderness with us deserves respect and space. The dogmen have been here long before us, and if we are wise, we will make sure they are here long after. They are part of the ecosystem, part of the natural order, and they have as much right to exist as any other predator. So that is my story. A hunter who went into the Appalachian mountains looking for elk and found something else entirely. 5 seconds of footage showing creatures that should not exist according to mainstream science, but which are as real as the trees and rocks and rivers. A family of dogmen moving through their territory, living their lives in the remote places where humans rarely go. And a reminder that no matter how much we think we know about the natural world, there are still mysteries waiting in the wild places, still wonders to be found for those brave or foolish enough to look. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.